It's a story that starts in the hallways of a school, in a place where everyone's supposed to be equal. But for one student, the idea of fitting in felt like a distant dream. From the moment he stepped through the doors, he knew it wouldn't be easy. He was different, and everyone around him seemed to make sure he knew it. Every glance, every whisper, every ignored plea for help, it was as if he didn't belong. There was no real reason for it, but there it was, every day, a constant reminder that he wasn't part of the crowd. He sat in the back of the class, the lonely kid with the worn backpack and shoes that were just a little too old. The teachers passed by him like he was invisible, and the other students didn't even bother to glance in his direction. He was, for all intents and purposes, forgotten by everyone around him. But what no one knew, what no one could see, was the fire burning inside him. He wasn't angry, though. No, anger wouldn't help him now. What he had was something far more powerful: determination. Day after day, the isolation grew heavier. He tried to speak up in class, but his voice was drowned out by the chatter of others. He tried to join in during recess, but it always felt like he was on the outside looking in. Every time he felt a spark of hope, it would quickly burn out, extinguished by the cold indifference of those around him. But something deep inside him kept him going. It was a quiet strength, one that wasn't loud or boastful. It was a kind of resilience that no one could take from him. And then, something changed. One afternoon, while sitting alone in the library, he overheard a conversation that made his heart race. It wasn't about him, but it was about something that could change everything. The words struck a chord deep inside him, something he didn't even realize had been lying dormant all this time. In that moment, he knew what he had to do. It was a plan, one so simple yet so powerful that it had the potential to shift everything around him. But it wasn't going to be easy. It wasn't going to be quick. And most of all, it wasn't going to be popular. For days he stayed up late, quietly working on his plan. It wasn't something he could do on his own, but the idea was too big, too important to ignore. He needed to make people see him, not just see him as a student, but as a person with ideas, with potential. He needed to show them that despite everything, he could contribute. And not just to his school, but to the whole town. The morning of the big event arrived, and the nervousness was overwhelming. Would anyone even care? Would anyone listen? He didn't know, but there was no turning back now. He had already made the choice. He had already taken the first step. As he walked into school that day, something felt different. It was like the air itself was charged with anticipation. But still, there was a sense of doubt creeping into his mind. He looked around the familiar hallways, where so many faces had ignored him, and wondered what they would think when they saw him do what he was about to do. It was going to be a risk, but he wasn't scared anymore. This was bigger than him now. The school bell rang, and just like every other day, the students flooded into their classrooms, chatting and laughing like they hadn't noticed him at all. But today, he was going to change that. He wasn't going to fade into the background. Today, he would be the one in charge of his own story. He walked to the front of the classroom and stood tall. His hands trembled, but his voice remained steady. "I'm not like everyone else here," he started. "But I don't need to be. And neither do any of you." The room fell silent. What happened next? You'll have to stick around to see how one quiet voice turned into a movement that no one could ignore. A simple act of courage, one that had been building for years, finally broke through the silence and made the entire town take notice. Would they finally understand him? Would his classmates, his teachers, the whole town see him for who he truly was? Or would his efforts be met with the same indifference that had defined his life up until now? The answer was just around the corner, and it was something that would change everything. The day had started like any other. The school bell rang, signaling the beginning of another long, monotonous stretch of classes, where the teachers would drone on about lessons that seemed distant and irrelevant. He sat at his usual desk at the back, trying to shrink into the background, trying to stay unnoticed. But that morning, something inside him had changed. Something deep within him had sparked, and for the first time in his life, he felt like he wasn't just another face in the crowd. He had never really had friends. Sure, there were people he spoke to now and then, classmates he'd nod to in the halls, a few brief interactions during lunch. But those fleeting moments didn't fill the emptiness inside him. They didn't erase the feeling of being invisible. And it wasn't just the other students who ignored him, it was the teachers too. Every day, he'd raise his hand to ask a question, and each time, it felt as though his voice was drowned out by the noise of the classroom. No one seemed to notice him. No one seemed to care. It wasn't always like this. When he was younger, he had been excited to go to school. He remembered walking into the kindergarten classroom with bright eyes, full of wonder about the world. But as he grew older, things started to change. People changed. The other kids started forming groups, creating bonds, and he found himself on the outside looking in. It wasn't just about race. It was more than that. It was as if he had become an invisible figure, someone whose presence didn't really matter. It hurt in ways he couldn't even explain. By middle school, it had gotten worse. There were kids who made fun of him, teased him about his clothes, his shoes, his hair. They called him names, and when they laughed, it wasn't with him. It was at him. He tried to ignore it, to tell himself it didn't matter. But deep down, it did. He longed for the connection that seemed so effortless for everyone else. He longed for a moment where someone would look at him, really see him, and say, "Hey, you matter." But no one did. He spent most of his days in the library, tucked away in the corner, reading books about heroes, about people who had done incredible things. It was his escape from the world he didn't feel a part of. The stories of those who overcame the odds, who fought for what they believed in, inspired him. They gave him something to hold on to, something to dream about. And slowly, quietly, he began to tell himself that maybe one day, he too would have a story. Maybe one day, he would make a difference. But even as he thought about it, the reality of his situation was hard to ignore. He was still the same forgotten kid, still the one no one bothered with. And yet, today was different. As he sat in the library, flipping through the pages of yet another book, something caught his attention. It wasn't anything particularly extraordinary at first. Just a conversation between a few students who had gathered around a table nearby. But as he listened in, something in their words grabbed hold of him. They were talking about a project. A big one. Something that could change the way their school operated, something that could make a real difference in the community. The words they spoke weren't groundbreaking, but the potential in them was undeniable. It was a chance to make an impact, to do something that would make people take notice. He wasn't sure why, but it felt like a spark had been lit in him, something that hadn't been there before. He couldn't ignore it. He had to act. For days he pondered what to do. Should he approach the group of students and offer his help? Would they even listen to him? The idea felt impossible. After all, he had spent his entire school life being overlooked. Why would they suddenly care now? But then it hit him. Maybe the whole point wasn't about them caring. Maybe the point was about showing them that he could do something big enough that they would have no choice but to notice. It wasn't about fitting in anymore. It wasn't about being liked or accepted. It was about proving to himself that he could be more than the kid who sat in the back, the kid who was ignored. It was about taking control of his own story. So, he began working in secret. He pored over the details of the project, taking notes, researching, planning. He wasn't sure what he was building toward, but he knew that he had to do something, anything, that would show everyone what he was capable of. He spent hours after school in the library, reading articles, writing out ideas, trying to put everything together in a way that would catch people's attention. And then, one day, he had an idea. It was a simple idea, but it was big. It could change everything. He wasn't just going to join the project, he was going to lead it. He was going to be the one to step up, to take charge, and show everyone that he wasn't just the invisible kid in the back of the room. He was someone who could lead, someone who could make a real impact. But how could he do that? How could he go from being the forgotten kid to someone who could make people listen? He wasn't sure, but he knew that he had to try. He had to take the first step, no matter how scary it was. So, on the day of the big meeting, when all the students gathered to discuss the project, he walked into the room with a quiet confidence. He wasn't loud, he wasn't brash. He simply walked up to the front of the room and spoke. His voice wasn't shaking like it had been before. He had found his strength, and he was going to use it. "I want to lead this project," he said, his words clear and steady. The room went silent. For a moment, no one spoke. The other students glanced at each other, unsure of how to respond. And then, after what felt like an eternity, one of them spoke up. "Are you serious?" He nodded. "Yes. I'm serious." There was a pause. They looked at each other, weighing the idea, and then they agreed. Slowly, one by one, they began to accept his proposal. It wasn't easy. Some of them were skeptical. They had seen him before, the quiet kid who sat in the back. But something in his demeanor, something in the way he spoke, made them reconsider. Maybe he wasn't the same person they had dismissed all this time. Maybe he was more than they had given him credit for. And so, the project began. But even as he stepped into this new role, something was nagging at him. He knew he had to do more. Leading the project was just the beginning. What came next was even more important. The town needed to see the change, to understand what this meant. He had a vision, a dream, one that would not just change his life but the lives of everyone around him. But how would they react? Would they embrace him, or would they reject him, just like they had rejected him for so many years? As the days passed and the project took shape, the tension began to build. He had started something that could make a real difference. But would it be enough? Would people truly see him for who he was? Or would they simply go back to their old ways, forgetting him once again? The answer to that question was just around the corner. And when it came, it would change everything. But for now, all he could do was wait and watch as the world around him began to shift. As the days passed and the project began to take root, the weight of the task ahead started to feel heavier. He thought leading the group would be the hardest part, but the real challenge was proving that the idea was worth believing in. The other students, while they had agreed to let him lead, still treated him with a sense of caution, as if waiting for him to prove himself. They weren't sure if he could pull this off, and he could feel their skepticism hanging in the air like a thick fog. The first few meetings were slow. He had his vision, his plans, but there was an undeniable gap between his ambitions and the group's ability to see them through. Some members were hesitant, unsure of how to approach the project. They liked the idea of change, but they weren't fully invested in it yet. They had their own lives, their own concerns, and this project felt like just another extracurricular activity that might fizzle out before it gained any real traction. It wasn't just the students that posed a problem, it was the school administration too. They had been passive when the idea was first presented. Their approval felt more like an obligation than genuine interest. Sure, they let the project move forward, but there was no real support behind it. No resources. No mentorship. He had hoped that by now, the faculty would see the potential in the project, but that didn't seem to be the case. Their indifference was palpable. Every time he walked into the principal's office to ask for help or ask about logistical concerns, he was met with polite smiles but empty promises. He couldn't help but feel that they didn't take him seriously. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was that the doubts started to creep in, not from the others, but from him. What if they were right? What if he wasn't capable of leading this project? He had seen how they all looked at him. Some were tentative, others simply indifferent. They were waiting for him to slip up, waiting for him to show them that he wasn't cut out for this. The imposter syndrome hit him hard. He began questioning every decision he made, second-guessing every move. What if he didn't have the skills? What if he wasn't smart enough to bring this vision to life? It was around this time that one of the more popular students, someone who had never really acknowledged him before, started showing up to the meetings. At first, he didn't think much of it. She was always surrounded by her own group, the people who were considered the cool kids. They were the ones who had always dismissed him, who had never looked his way. But now, she was attending every meeting, offering suggestions, asking questions. It felt like a lifeline. She started offering advice on how to improve the project, pushing them to think outside the box. Her suggestions were good, practical, and her influence slowly began to shape the direction of the work. But even as he appreciated her help, something inside him felt uneasy. He wasn't sure if he could trust her. Why was she suddenly interested? What was she hoping to get out of this? Was this all just some game to her, or was she truly invested in seeing the project succeed? As the project began to gather more momentum, word about it started to spread through the school. It was the first time in years that anyone had attempted something of this magnitude. Some students began showing up at meetings, wanting to be a part of the change. Others, however, started to whisper behind his back. They said things like, "Who does he think he is?" Or "He's just trying to make a name for himself." He had heard it all before, but now, it stung in a way that it hadn't before. The more successful the project became, the more the whispers seemed to grow louder. It was like they couldn't stand seeing him succeed, especially when they had always written him off as nothing more than an invisible kid in the back of the room. But what they didn't realize was that he wasn't doing this for them. He wasn't doing this for their approval. He was doing this for himself. He needed to prove that he could do something that mattered, something that would change not only his life but the lives of others. That's what kept him going even when things got tough, even when doubts threatened to swallow him whole. Despite the external pressure, something unexpected happened. The project started to resonate with a small group of students, those who had been ignored, left out, or bullied over the years. They saw what he was doing and began to rally behind him. It was the first time they had ever been included in something that felt important, something that gave them a voice. They started showing up at meetings, bringing their ideas, offering their help. It wasn't just about the project anymore. It became a movement, one that extended far beyond the confines of the school walls. For the first time in his life, he felt like he was part of something bigger than himself. But the more the project grew, the more attention it started to attract. It wasn't long before the local community caught wind of what was happening. At first, the response was cautiously optimistic. People admired the ambition, the idea of empowering students to take charge and make a difference. The local news even covered the project briefly, painting it as a beacon of hope and change for the town. But with that attention came scrutiny. People started asking questions, trying to dig deeper into who was behind this and what their motivations were. They wanted to know what the real story was. This was where the tension reached a boiling point. People who had once been content to sit on the sidelines were now starting to get involved, some with good intentions, others with more self-serving interests. The town council, which had once shown no interest in the project, suddenly wanted to get involved. They offered to help fund the initiative, to support the efforts of the students. But as the saying goes, nothing is ever truly free. They wanted something in return. They wanted control. They wanted to steer the project in a direction that aligned with their own agendas. For him, the thought of compromising his vision for the sake of appeasing the council was unbearable. This project wasn't about politics. It wasn't about satisfying the egos of adults who had never understood what it was like to be in his shoes. But the pressure was mounting. The town's leaders weren't just offering their support, they were demanding a seat at the table. It was clear they saw this as an opportunity to manipulate the narrative, to make it about them. The idea of the project being hijacked for political gain made him feel sick to his stomach. The group was split. Some students were eager to accept the council's help, thinking it would be a chance to get more resources and publicity. They saw the potential for more recognition, more exposure. Others, however, felt the same way he did. They didn't want to lose the authenticity of what they were trying to build. They didn't want to let the town's leaders take over something that was meant to be a grassroots effort, something created by students for students. And so, the conflict grew. Each side had its own vision for what the project should be, and as tensions built, cracks began to form within the group. He had always been the quiet kid in the back of the room, but now, he found himself at the center of a storm. The choices he made in the coming days would determine the future of the project and future of the town itself. But no matter which way he turned, there was no easy answer. As the days ticked by, the stakes continued to rise. Would he stay true to the original vision of the project? Would he stand up to the people who had always overlooked him, or would he succumb to the pressures of those who now wanted to take credit for what he had started? The uncertainty loomed over him like a dark cloud, and the weight of it felt almost unbearable. But there was one thing he knew for sure: he couldn't back down now. Not when so much was at stake. Not when so many people were depending on him to see this through. What he didn't know yet was just how far the consequences of his decisions would stretch. The pressure continued to mount with each passing day. He could feel it in the pit of his stomach, gnawing at him. The expectations, the doubts, the competing visions, it was all becoming too much to handle. The project that had once been a hopeful spark of change now felt like a beast he could no longer control. Every decision was crucial, and yet, every decision felt like it could lead to disaster. He had become so consumed by the weight of it all that even simple tasks started to feel monumental. Every time he spoke to a new group of students or approached a faculty member, he felt like he was walking a tightrope, trying not to fall, but knowing that the fall could happen at any moment. The group's dynamics were shifting. The divide between those who wanted to keep the project authentic and those who were tempted by the allure of external validation was growing deeper. They had begun arguing more frequently, with some members accusing others of being sellouts or afraid of real change. Those who wanted to take the town council's offer of support were convinced it was the only way to get the resources they needed, while the others believed that taking the council's money would compromise everything they had worked for. The lines were being drawn, and the atmosphere was thick with tension. The other students who had once been part of the project seemed to be losing faith in him as a leader. The ones who had been his closest allies were now questioning his decisions, offering solutions he wasn't sure would work. Even the student who had been the most enthusiastic, who had stepped up to lead meetings and rally the others, was starting to pull back. Her actions, once motivated by a desire for genuine change, now seemed driven by something else. Her questions began to feel more pointed, more tactical. Was she really in this for the right reasons, or was she playing a game? But the most unsettling part was that he didn't know if he could trust anyone anymore. He had believed in the team, in their shared vision, but now, everything felt like it was unraveling. He had tried to keep everyone's spirits high, tried to remind them why they started the project in the first place. But the cracks were starting to show. The whispers about his leadership, about his ability to carry this through, had become louder, and no matter how hard he tried to drown them out, they kept echoing in his mind. The town had become divided too. Some residents rallied behind the project, eager to see something positive come out of the school, something that could bring the community together. Others, however, viewed the initiative with suspicion. They didn't understand why the school was taking on such a bold endeavor, and they didn't trust the students to execute it. The town was filled with old wounds, a history of divisions that had never truly healed. People who had once supported each other now saw each other as competitors, as threats to their own survival. The project, once a symbol of hope, was now a flashpoint for those old resentments. The more time that passed, the more the project seemed to alienate both the school administration and the town. At first, the faculty had been willing to give them a chance, but now, they were growing impatient. The project had reached a point where they needed more than just encouragement, they needed resources, mentorship, and guidance. And the school's administration, with all its promises, was offering none of it. In fact, they seemed more interested in covering their own backs than in actually helping the students succeed. Their approval was becoming harder and harder to come by, and the group could sense it. The tension reached its peak the day of the town council meeting. This was the moment. The one he had been dreading but also had to face. The meeting had been scheduled for weeks, and it was where the council would decide whether to throw their full support behind the project or pull back altogether. The air was thick with anticipation as the group gathered, waiting for the council members to walk in. He could feel the weight of their eyes on him, some filled with hope, others with doubt. The student who had been the most vocal about accepting the council's offer was by his side. She was standing a little too close, her words a little too insistent. He had never been sure of her intentions, but now he felt the distance between them had grown too wide to bridge. She kept talking about how much they could do with the council's money, how much they could accomplish if they just accepted their offer. But he couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Was she really in it for the right reasons? Or was she more interested in what she could gain from the town's involvement? Her persuasive arguments only seemed to make him more uncertain. The council members entered the room, and with them, the feeling of finality. This was it. The moment when everything would either come together or fall apart. As the meeting began, the words exchanged between the council and the students became a blur. The council's offer was generous, more than any of them had expected. But there was something about the way they framed it that made it feel like a deal with the devil. They promised funding, resources, and a seat at the table, but only if the students were willing to give up control. They wanted the project to align with their vision, to be molded into something that would reflect well on the town. They wanted their fingerprints on every decision. And as he sat there, listening to them speak, he realized something that made his heart sink. They weren't offering help, they were offering ownership. The tension in the room was palpable. The council's offer was so tempting, so hard to turn down. The team was already under immense pressure. How could they say no? They needed the money. They needed the support. The group was already divided, and this offer felt like a lifeline. But he knew that if they accepted it, the project would never be what it was supposed to be. It would become just another political tool, another piece of propaganda for the town's leaders to claim credit for. The room seemed to close in around him as the council members spoke. Every word they said made him feel more and more trapped. He knew that accepting their help might be the only way to keep the project alive, but he also knew that doing so would betray everything they had worked for. The voices in his head screamed at him to take the deal, to make the compromises, to just get it over with. But something inside him, something deep and stubborn, refused to let go. He couldn't let them take this away from him. Not now. Not when it had become more than just a school project. The others in the room were watching him, waiting for him to make the call. His heart pounded in his chest, and his mind raced. The council members were looking at him expectantly, as if this decision was in his hands and his hands alone. And maybe it was. Maybe he was the only one who could see the bigger picture. Maybe he was the only one who could make the right choice. As the minutes ticked by, the weight of the decision grew heavier and heavier. The group was looking to him for leadership. The council was looking to him for compliance. And in that moment, he realized that what happened next could change everything, not just for the project, but for his entire town. He opened his mouth to speak, but the words caught in his throat. Would he stand firm, or would he cave? Would he protect the integrity of the project, or would he let the forces around him shape it into something unrecognizable? The future was hanging in the balance, and the answer wasn't clear. The words still hung in the air, heavy and uncertain. He took a slow breath, his mind spinning, desperately searching for clarity. The decision seemed impossible, and yet there was no way out. The room waited for him to speak. The students, the council members, even the air itself seemed to be holding its breath. But just as he was about to open his mouth, a figure walked in from the back of the room, unannounced. A chill swept through the gathering, and all eyes turned to the newcomer. It was a person none of them expected to see, someone who hadn't been involved with the project from the beginning but whose presence now threatened to change everything. The figure was an older man, someone with a reputation in the town. His presence alone had the power to shift the entire dynamic. He was someone who had been in charge of many of the town's biggest decisions over the years, someone who had worked closely with the council and had a network of influence that stretched far beyond the school or the community. He wasn't just any figurehead, he was a symbol of authority and power, and his arrival sent waves of tension throughout the room. His entrance caught the council members off guard, and the students, including him, could see the shock in their eyes. He didn't wait for an invitation. He didn't need to. His reputation had always been one that commanded respect, even if that respect was often laced with fear. He stepped forward and addressed the room, his voice deep and calm, but laced with an undeniable force. "Sorry to interrupt," he said, his eyes scanning the room, lingering on the students, then the council. "But I think we need to have a conversation before you make any decisions about this project." The council members stiffened, their expressions shifting from surprise to irritation. This wasn't part of the plan. The room fell silent as the man's gaze locked onto the leader of the project. He felt a coldness creep up his spine. This man was a wild card. He didn't know what the man's motivations were, but he knew this wasn't a coincidence. Nothing in this town happened by chance. The students here have worked hard, the man continued, his tone now softer, but his words still sharp. And I can respect that. But you should know the consequences of involving certain parties in this project may be far-reaching. He turned toward the council, who appeared increasingly uncomfortable with his intrusion. Perhaps more than you realize. His words didn't sit well with anyone. They felt like a challenge, a veiled warning. The council members exchanged glances, their unease palpable. He could see that they were no longer entirely sure of their position. "What are you trying to say?" one of the council members finally asked, her voice cautious. The man smiled, but it wasn't a friendly smile. "I'm saying that this town, for all its promises of change, has its secrets. And those secrets can be dangerous." The air grew heavy, and the room seemed to shrink around them. The students, including him, exchanged confused glances. What was this about? Why was he here, and what did he mean by secrets? The man took a few steps closer, his voice lowering as if he was about to share something no one was supposed to hear. "You think you're fighting for progress," he said, addressing the group directly now. "But there are forces at play here that you don't understand. Powerful people who have controlled this town for decades. People who won't let some student-led project disrupt their plans. You may think you're taking a stand, but you could be opening the door to something far more dangerous than you can imagine." A chill ran through the group, and for the first time, the students began to doubt everything they had been working for. Could it really be true? Was there more going on in this town than they had known? The weight of his words was sinking in, and the sense of uncertainty that had been hovering over the project now grew into something more sinister. He felt his heart race as the man's words continued to echo in his mind. What if they were playing into a larger game that they didn't even know existed? What if the project, the cause they had all been fighting for, was never meant to succeed at all? What if this entire town was caught in a struggle much bigger than anything they could comprehend? The council members were now visibly shaken, their once confident demeanor slipping. They were no longer sure of their ground. The man's presence had shaken their resolve, and the tension in the room was now at an all-time high. He noticed that even the student who had been the most eager to accept the council's offer was starting to look conflicted, as if the offer wasn't so appealing anymore. The man gave them a moment to process his words, and then, as if satisfied with the chaos he had stirred, he turned and began to walk toward the door. "Just think carefully," he said over his shoulder, his voice carrying a finality that sent shivers down their spines. "Because once you open this door, there's no going back." With that, he left, disappearing as quickly as he had arrived, leaving behind a room full of stunned faces. The silence that followed was suffocating. He could barely hear his own thoughts over the pounding of his heart. The weight of the man's warning hung in the air like a dark cloud, and for the first time, he wasn't sure if they were fighting for the right cause or walking into a trap they couldn't escape from. The council members exchanged uncertain glances. One of them cleared their throat and spoke first. "What does he mean by that?" They all seemed to be asking the same question, their voices barely audible. The student who had been pushing hardest for the council's support now turned to him. Her face was pale, and she looked like she might say something, but no words came out. Instead, she simply nodded, as if processing everything that had just happened. The doubt that had been creeping into her voice was now undeniable. He glanced around the room, seeing the unease in everyone's eyes. The entire town, the project, their dreams of making a difference, everything had just shifted. The decision was no longer simple. What had once seemed like a clear path forward now felt like a precarious cliff, and the only thing he could feel was the ground crumbling beneath his feet. There were no easy answers now. The stakes were higher than ever before. Whatever choice they made next would either save the project or tear it apart, and neither option seemed certain. And then the unthinkable happened. As the council began to murmur among themselves, another figure entered the room, this time from the opposite door. A figure they all recognized. Someone who had kept to the shadows up until now. He didn't speak immediately, but his presence sent a wave of shock through everyone. And then, with a single word, he dropped the bombshell that would change everything. "I'm here to help. But not in the way you think." The room fell silent again, the air thick with anticipation. Everyone turned to the newcomer, who had just spoken. His words hung heavily between them, like a confession and a warning all in one. He didn't look like someone who was there to offer help. His face was set in a grim expression, his posture rigid as he looked over the group. "I'm here to help," he repeated, his voice cold. "But not in the way you think." The confusion in the room was palpable. The students, already on edge after the unsettling encounter with the man who had left just moments ago, now exchanged uncertain glances. He could feel the unease spreading like a virus, and for the first time, he realized that everything they had fought for, everything they had hoped for, could be slipping away. They were caught in a web of forces they barely understood, and they were beginning to wonder if there was any way out. "Who are you?" one of the council members asked, his voice shaky but demanding an answer. The newcomer didn't flinch. He stepped forward, his eyes narrowing, as if measuring each of them. "My name isn't important," he said. "What matters is this: you're not the first to try to change things here. And you won't be the last. But you need to understand something, all of you. There's a power in this town that goes deeper than you realize. What you've been trying to do, what you think is a victory, it's all part of a much bigger plan." The words hit like a blow to the chest. He could see the doubt creeping into the council members' eyes, the realization that they had been too naive, too quick to believe that this project would be the key to unlocking the town's future. He didn't know who this man was, but he could tell that his words carried weight. Something about the way he spoke told him that this wasn't just a warning, it was a threat. The council leader, visibly shaken, stepped forward. "You're saying everything we've done so far is a lie?" The man didn't answer immediately. Instead, he reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a folder, placing it in front of the council with a deliberate gesture. "I'm saying that what you've been working toward is nothing more than a distraction. The people behind this, people you don't even know, have been controlling the narrative from the very beginning. You've been used, manipulated." He felt his heart race. He had no idea where this was going, but every instinct in him screamed that they were on the edge of something much darker than they had imagined. The council members hesitated, but curiosity and fear kept them rooted to the spot. The man opened the folder and slid a piece of paper across the table. On it was a map of the town, but it was unlike any map he had seen before. There were markings all over its streets, buildings, locations, but all connected by a series of lines that seemed to form a complex web. "This town has been controlled for years," the man continued, his voice growing more intense. "Every major decision made here, every development, every change, it's all been planned. You think the project you're working on is the solution? It's just the next piece in a much larger game." He couldn't believe what he was hearing. This was madness, right? Surely, this man was just trying to manipulate them, play on their fears. But the map in front of him told a different story. He had seen how the town operated, how things worked beneath the surface. But this was something entirely different. "What does this mean?" one of the students asked, his voice barely a whisper. The man looked at him, and for the first time, there was a flicker of something uncertainty, maybe behind his cold eyes. "It means you've been fighting a battle with the wrong people. The ones who have the power here are not the ones you think." The words hit him like a punch. His mind raced, trying to piece it all together. The whole town, his whole world, had been a lie. All the trust they had placed in their leaders, in the system, in the idea of change, it had all been part of a carefully constructed illusion. He couldn't think. Couldn't breathe. This wasn't the way it was supposed to happen. This wasn't the plan. The project was meant to be their way out, a chance to make a real difference. But now, with this man's words sinking in, he wasn't sure what to believe anymore. "What do you want from us?" the council leader finally asked, his voice cracking under the pressure. The man didn't hesitate. "I want you to understand that this fight, it's bigger than any of you. If you truly want to make a difference, if you want to change this town, you need to stop looking at it as a simple project. You need to look at the bigger picture." And with that, the room exploded into chaos. The council members were arguing now, the students trying to make sense of everything they had just heard. They all spoke at once, asking questions, demanding answers. But none of them were prepared for the final revelation. The man stood up, as calm and collected as ever. "I've been sent here to tell you the truth. But I can't stay. The town has already started to notice your little rebellion. And the people pulling the strings, they won't let you get away with it. Not this time." With that, he turned and walked out, leaving behind a room full of stunned, speechless people. And then, as if on cue, the lights flickered. A sudden crash echoed from the hallway, followed by a scream. Panic erupted, and the students rushed to the door, only to find that the entire building was in chaos. The town was descending into turmoil, and he had no idea what had just set it off. But he knew one thing: everything they had believed was about to be torn apart. The truth was out, and there was no going back. The fight for change was no longer just about a project or a cause, it was a battle for the very heart of the town itself. And in that moment, he realized the most shocking truth of all: the person who had been behind it all, the one pulling the strings, the one orchestrating this entire drama, was someone he had never suspected. Someone he had trusted all along. The story wasn't over. Not yet. And the real fight had just begun. The chaos that followed was unlike anything he had ever witnessed. The building was flooded with people's shouts and footsteps echoing down the hallways, the tension so thick it felt like it could suffocate you. He was paralyzed for a moment, standing in the middle of the room, staring at the door the man had just walked through. The question that lingered in his mind was simple, but it carried the weight of everything that had come before. What just happened? The man had left a trail of devastation in his wake, and now they were left with nothing but questions. And fear. They weren't just afraid of what had been revealed, but of what was coming next. The silence that followed the man's departure was more deafening than the clamor that had filled the room moments before. He didn't know where to go. His mind raced, each thought leading to another question without an answer. The map. The cryptic message. And the revelation that this entire town, this community he thought he understood, was far more complicated, far more twisted, than he could have ever imagined. And then, like a jolt of electricity, the realization hit him. The leader. The one they had trusted, the one who had seemed so confident, so sure of their path forward. The person who had led them all here. The moment everything shifted was when the council leader turned around, his face pale and stricken with an emotion that was impossible to place. The man's hands trembled slightly, a stark contrast to the composed figure they had all relied on up until now. Without a word, the leader motioned for the students to come together. "We need to meet. Now." The panic that had initially gripped him started to dissipate, replaced by a cold, calculating clarity. This was their moment. They didn't have answers, but the town was changing, and they could either let it happen, or they could try to steer it toward a future they believed in. But this time, it wouldn't be based on the lies and deceptions they had been fed. The council's building had always been a place of authority, of decision-making and plans. Now it felt more like a cage. He could feel the walls closing in, but he couldn't stop. The adrenaline pushed him forward, despite the confusion swirling in his head. They gathered around a small table, the atmosphere charged. No one spoke at first. Everyone was too lost in their own thoughts, processing everything the mysterious man had said. The weight of the truth was heavier than they had anticipated, and no one knew how to navigate the path forward. "We've all been played," the council leader finally said, his voice low but filled with something guilt, maybe. "And I've been part of it." His words hung in the air, and for a moment, no one knew how to react. The truth had already been shattered, but now they had to face the consequences of it. There was no denying it anymore. The system they had worked to build, the ideals they had fought for, had been nothing more than a fade. The leader lowered his head in shame. "I thought we were doing the right thing. I thought we were trying to help. But I see now that we've all been manipulated." It was the first time the council leader had shown vulnerability. The students, who had come to see this man as a pillar of authority, now understood that no one was immune from the webs of control that had ensnared them all. He stepped forward, his heart pounding. "What do we do now? Do we fight this? Do we try to expose it all?" The leader shook his head. "It's not that simple. The people behind this, they control everything. They've made sure that any move we make will be countered before we even realize it." The students exchanged uneasy glances. Everything they had worked toward, everything they had believed in, seemed like it was slipping through their fingers. But that wasn't the end of it. It couldn't be. They couldn't let it end like this. They had already taken too many steps forward to retreat now. There was a long silence before another voice broke through. One of the students, who had been quiet up until now, spoke. "We can't give up. If we do, then they've won. We have to keep going." Her words struck a chord with everyone in the room. The truth had been revealed, but that didn't mean their fight had to end. They had the chance to rewrite the narrative, to take back control. They couldn't afford to let fear dictate their actions. They were already in too deep, and the stakes were too high. A plan began to form. They couldn't confront the forces controlling the town head-on, not yet, at least, but they could start by spreading the word. They could take small steps, carefully, to undermine the system from within. The revelation had already planted a seed of doubt in the minds of the townspeople, and it was their job to nurture that seed into something that could grow. But they knew that it wasn't just about them. This fight was bigger than any one person. It was about the future of the town, and the future of every person who lived in it. They needed to find allies to gather support. They needed to be strategic and patient, because the people who had controlled everything for so long weren't going to give up without a fight. In the following weeks, the students and the council members worked tirelessly behind the scenes. They talked to people, gathered information, and slowly started to peel back the layers of corruption. The town, once so tightly controlled, began to shift. The cracks that had started to show became wider, and the people who had once been afraid to speak out now found the courage to stand up. The battle wasn't easy. There were moments when it felt like everything was falling apart, when it seemed like the forces they were up against were just too powerful. But each victory, no matter how small, pushed them closer to the truth. And then, one day, the one who had set everything into motion, the one who had exposed the lies, returned. But this time, he didn't come alone. The students, now emboldened by their efforts, stood together, waiting for him. When he stepped into the room, there was no fear in their eyes. Only determination. "You've done well," the man said, his voice unexpectedly calm. "But this is just the beginning. What happens next is up to you." They had learned a lot in those few weeks about the town, about the people who ran it, and most importantly, about themselves. They had learned that change wasn't something that happened overnight. It wasn't easy, and it wasn't always fair. But it was possible. The man's words didn't scare them anymore. They were ready for whatever came next. And so, the town began to change, not overnight, not in a single sweeping gesture, but slowly, steadily, and in ways that no one could have predicted. The people who had once been afraid found their voices. The systems that had held them back began to crumble. The seeds of hope that had been planted in the hearts of the few grew into something bigger than anyone had imagined. The battle had been long, and it had been difficult, but they had done it. They had faced the truth, no matter how painful it was, and they had fought for what they believed in. And in the end, they had won. But the lesson they carried with them was simple: change wasn't something you waited for. It was something you fought for. The town would never be the same again. And neither would they.